First of all, thank you again for all being here. I'm really, really excited to talk about geography and how it ties into campus recruiting, not just for those who face quote unquote difficult locations, but also how organizations are using geography to get a competitive advantage. Now, again, coming out of COVID 5 years ago, I think we all thought geography was going to be less important, especially in the age of remote work. Companies thought they could replace career fairs and on-site interviews and everything else with video, or that with remote work becoming so important, people will be able to work from anywhere, irrespective of where the company is. I think we all quickly found out that wasn't the case. What we found is geography continues to shape early career recruiting. Recruiting strategies are still focusing on a few local or focus schools. So companies are posting roles broadly and doing some virtual events, but they're finding it doesn't quite have the impact. They're also finding that while students are highly mobile, they still want to build real connections with companies during the recruiting process. Companies and actually even students are also continuing to see the importance of being on site during that summer internship and that full-time role. And this is especially important during the first few years in the workforce. The impact of this is really twofold. First, how can companies that might not be in the biggest cities, those companies in Indianapolis, or Kansas City, or St. Louis, or Charlotte, or Omaha, or other places throughout the country, reach students who might want to be there upon graduation? But they might be going to school elsewhere. They want to come home, but they're attending school in Florida or Texas or California or Boston. They also may not necessarily be thinking about those companies. So while they want to get home, they may have some preconceived notions. The second big impact is that companies are trying to figure out how they can efficiently and effectively reach students who may be attending schools beyond the local geography or beyond the focus programs. We know budgets continue to be under pressure, and we know campus recruiters can't be everywhere. And this is especially true when it comes to recruiting at some of the smaller schools, where the numbers just don't work to have the same presence as they do with the large Research One state institutions. And by the way, speaking of budget, it's not just about traveling to the campus and the career fairs and hosting info sessions. It's also about travel tied to bringing the students in for those on-site interviews and super days and other recruiting efforts. So what we're going to do today is talk about 4 very specific strategies that we're seeing. First, we're going to cover how companies in quote unquote difficult locations can engage with students who want to be there, and not just be there, but to stay. The student from Indianapolis who attends school on the coast, but think they have to go to California or Boston to do interesting tech work, because they don't necessarily realize Indianapolis is a hotbed of technology. The second example will be how companies are using geography to create a competitive advantage versus their peers. Companies wind up competing oftentimes for the same talent from the same schools as everyone else. How can companies use geography to really get a proprietary pool of qualified candidates that their competitors may be missing? Third, we'll talk about how organizations can effectively assess skills and fit earlier in the process before flying students or employees all over the place, only to realize at the end that it's not the right fit or match. And then finally, how to build those relationships authentically, even if you can't be on campus as frequently as you'd like. And this is important because for any of you who follow the data from the National Association of Colleges and Employers or otherwise, we know students want to build real authentic connections with those organizations. And we know virtual interviews and Zooms aren't doing it. We also know that those connections make a ton of difference in converting and retaining. But again, how can you do that even if you can't be everywhere? So we're going to jump in again with 4 examples. As I said, feel free to use the chat along the way with questions or comments. The first example is tied to one of those, again, difficult locations. And I want to be very clear, I am a huge fan of Cincinnati, especially when it comes to graders and Skyline. But many college students aren't thinking about it, especially for technology roles. They may know Cincinnati, but they know about P&G or Fifth Third or even Cintas, but they don't realize the plethora of technology roles available both at those companies, but also the smaller venture-backed tech companies. Meanwhile, these same students may go to school elsewhere, but want to return home upon graduation. It could be because of family, or to the comment in the chat, the cost of living, or any number of other reasons. But again, they think they have to go to San Francisco or Boston to do interesting tech. In the meantime, this venture-backed company had great relationships with so many of the local schools, University of Cincinnati, OSU, Kentucky, and Indiana, but didn't really have the resources to reach those students beyond those schools. And what was also interesting is while they were able to hire that amazing Bearcat out of University of Cincinnati, they found that the student often left within the first year or so. They had great ties to the city while they were in school, but after graduation, they didn't feel those ties. So instead of the spray and pray that they were calling it with the job postings and emails, what this organization did was they created a couple of small projects that really showcased the interesting technology they were working on. Projects like researching AI trends or creating a rapid prototype of a new app, projects that were enticing to college students. And instead of just posting these on job boards or on their company's website where they had to kind of hope the student was going to show up, what they did is they posted them exclusively for students with existing ties to Cincinnati. These projects stood out to drive interest, again, on these first couple from a few hundred students, not just at those focus schools, but for students from Cincinnati across the country. This was without setting foot on campus or spending money to blast out emails or mine databases. Over time, they continued to use this, ultimately reaching over 1,000 students from over 400 schools across the country. Now, what was really important is not only could they reach the students, but what happened? Did they get hired? Did they stay? As you can see from the screen, the numbers sort of speak for themselves. This organization found over a 3 times improvement in their conversion rate as they were getting students that wanted to be in Cincinnati. And by the way, when they joined, they didn't quit. They didn't leave within the first year like 50% of recent college grads do across the board. These are students that wanted to be in Cincinnati, and when they got that great offer with that great company, they had the connections, which drove them to stay. So geography clearly matters for those in smaller cities or rural towns, but what about those organizations that are national, who have locations in large cities and small towns alike? This consulting firm had exactly that challenge. They were one of the most prestigious strategic consulting firms, but they certainly were not as big as the Accentures or Deloittes. They were also, though, going to the same big schools as every other firm. As a result, they wound up competing with the same companies for the same handful of talent with the same GPAs and the same major. But unlike the Accentures or Deloittes, this organization wasn't spending millions of dollars on recruiting, nor did it have the massive team to be at every school. One of the things they noticed from some internal data they had was that even though hiring managers were saying they only wanted to recruit from the same group of schools, this organization was getting a lot of ad hoc hires from some smaller programs, liberal arts schools, schools around the country that were not traditional feeders into strategy consulting. And in some cases, these were local schools, but in others, they came from that random connection, that friend or colleague who asks you to talk to their son or daughter. It winds up being a great hire. But the question was how to tap into this talent with the resources they had and still create an open environment that wasn't relying on their network, and how to do it without a 6-figure budget to spend on industry insights or marketing platforms. So again, they started by trying to leverage their own internal network to get these referrals, but they found it wasn't really scalable and it had some biases built in. And then even when they had the name of the contact, they didn't really have the resources to keep them engaged. So like in the prior example, they used small projects to break through. They found that many students at the smaller schools weren't either thinking about consulting or thought they weren't really qualified. And even if they were thinking about consulting, they were getting missed by the existing process. By using some of these small tasks, they could essentially, as they said, fish in ponds that were being ignored. Now, to be clear, this is strategic consulting. This firm was working with clients on projects that were highly, highly, highly confidential, and everything was sensitive. So what this organization did was they used tasks that were more tied to general research, like market sizing or industry studies. Now, while the students were doing these projects on their own, they were still building relationships with the actual hiring managers. Again, submitting the work, getting feedback, jumping on a quick call. What this let them do was not only uncover the talent getting missed, but it formed that relationship between the student and the hiring manager that gave them a competitive advantage when the offer was made, an advantage that wasn't based upon salary or fancy swag, but based upon the student feeling that connection to the firm. What this firm also found was over time, it gave them an inside track with some of those smaller schools. These smaller schools felt special because they were often ignored just because of the student population size. And what was happening was faculty members were proactively serving as this firm's advocates and ambassadors, highlighting the firm to students and sharing insights on students that they thought would be a great fit. And to the point about insights, that's so important because assessing skills is really, really top of mind. The third example I'll share is about assessing the skills. I think we know it is so hard to evaluate a candidate's skills from a resume or even in an interview. And even if you can be on campus, getting insights on communication and empathy and those other core skills is so difficult. This is why we see so much frustration from hiring managers, both along the way in the process or even after the hire is made, about students not having the communication or problem solving or empathy that they're looking for. This bank had that exact issue. They were getting plenty of candidates, thousands for every open role. And they had a well-honed process, but it still wasn't working. They were doing phone screens and initial on-campus interviews, but were finding when the next round of interviews were taking place, they'd hear from the hiring manager that the student bombed. Or they would try discussing the difference between all of the different roles within the firm at the info session, their super days. But when students were coming for the interviews or for the full-time role, some of these students didn't know the difference between the equity research role and corporate finance or M&A or sales and trading. On top of that, the cost per hire was, I was going to say, out of this world. It still shocks me looking at some of these numbers. This organization shared that in addition to what they were spending on campus visits and all of the other stuff, they were spending about $4,000 per individual on travel, just flying them to New York, putting them up in the hotel for the super days or interviews. And again, that was it before any of the other costs associated with the process. So this organization was trying to figure out how can they screen better beforehand, recognizing that everyone had to be in New York and again, the existing focus schools. Now, one of the things they certainly tried beforehand was better interview training. And they were adding various assessments and a bunch of other things to try to predict these things earlier in the process. What they ultimately realized is those things weren't working, but there was one tool that actually did work. One thing that ultimately drove their hiring decision. It was the case interviews. I'm not sure how many of you have gone through this process. So case interviews are usually about an hour long. In some cases, they're half a day, or in the case of McKinsey, almost a day long, where candidates are given information on a hypothetical client, and the candidate essentially analyzes the data and presents their perspective to a hiring manager. Well, this bank was doing it as one of the last steps of the process, and again, incredibly effective in separating the wheat from the chaff. The problem was they were doing it at the end, after they had already invested a ton of money and time, and at the last step, figuring out someone wasn't the right fit. Their question was, how could they put it at the front of their process at the beginning, but do so in a way that didn't require hiring managers to spend hours and hours and hours of time at the beginning? So what they actually did, and again, we actually did this for them, was took some of their case interviews and actually unpack them into smaller, I think they called them micro cases that they could do on their own, but was still teasing out some of those same skills and qualifications that came normally at the end. But again, unlike the traditional model they were using, they were doing it as the initial step in the process. So instead of hiring managers spending hours walking through it, the recruiting team was able to essentially present the student's work to a hiring manager in a one-page summary. Now, first of all, the students loved it. It was a great way for them to learn about the role and the difference between all of the different roles and drive interest in the firm. But the hiring managers loved it as well, as they could spend about 2 minutes looking at the work and pretty quickly knew if this is someone they wanted to meet. And it's not just on the technical aspects of the work, whether it's a discounted cash flow or market size analysis or anything else, but the process also let the bank get some other insights on each candidate. What's the level of interest by the student, as evidenced by the fact that they were willing to engage and do the work? Attention to detail from the work they submitted. It wasn't like looking at a resume that's been scrubbed to perfection, but they were seeing much more authentic view. They were also able to tease out, did the candidate turn the work in on time? How did they communicate along the way? Was it professional? Now, again, to be clear, they weren't just taking that micro case and saying, congratulations, Jeff, you're hired. They were still doing the more comprehensive interview process, including the deep dive case later in the process. But what this helped them do was quickly tease out those things that often didn't come up until the very end. Again, letting them make better decisions at the top of the funnel. What it was also doing was it was giving both the recruiting team and the hiring manager some additional areas that they might want to focus in on or dive into deeper throughout the process. Again, Jeff may have done a great job in a lot of ways, but was there something he missed that we may want to dig into more, again, in that final interview? Now, one other thing to be clear about that was really important to this organization, they paid the students to do these micro cases. And they did it for two reasons. First of all, they wanted to make sure they weren't filtering out candidates that couldn't afford to invest the 10 or so hours. They couldn't afford to do it for free. But something else that was said from the executives said this is key. They insisted on paying the students. And that's because this firm had a lot of senior executives that came from low income backgrounds, where they themselves were working part-time or full-time while in school to pay. They insisted that the students were paid for their work. But even with these payments, this organization found they were able to decrease their recruiting travel budget by about 40%. And that was a massive component of their overall campus recruiting expense. What was also interesting is this organization had a very, very strong conversion of offer to hire. What they didn't have was interview to hire. What they saw was about a 2x increase compared to the norm. What that means is they were spending better time interviewing the right folks. They had to spend less time interviewing each individual to tease out who were the right hires. Beyond that, as I alluded to before, the hiring managers were ecstatic. Now, this bank did not share their internal NPS with us, but as I think you can probably see from the quote on the right, I think that kind of captures it. So while we talked about driving interest in your location and really creating competitive advantage with your talent pipeline and getting insights on skills earlier, the last core aspect really brings us back to where we started, that students want to build real relationships with employers. How can we do that in the post-COVID environment where so much is remote, but the budgets don't necessarily allow being on site as much as we would like? That's exactly what this Fortune 500 organization was trying to do. And on top of it, while they were based in a very large metropolitan area, they had offices throughout the US, including in many very small towns. They also struggled with so many of the other challenges other employers face. Again, they were massive, but didn't necessarily have the student brand recognition. They had thousands of employees, but a tiny campus recruiting practice. And on top of it, many of the departments only wanted to hire experienced professionals, even for roles that a more junior person could have been the right fit. Now, beyond the cost associated with this overhiring, what they also said was the C-suite was incredibly frustrated with it. Not just because of cost, but they were really worried about building that future talent internally. So while the CEO and CHRO certainly could have forced the issue and said, we're going to ramp up early career hiring, the campus recruiting team took a different approach. Essentially, what they did was they went to existing professionals at this organization and said, we're going to make a new resource available. We know how busy you are, so we're going to let you work with individuals on small projects that you're trying to get off your plate. And with many of the professionals working on tasks that were truly too junior for them, given their approach, they loved it. So what happened was these hiring managers were going into the portal to, again, offload these small tasks. And to be clear, these weren't tasks that were secretive or tasks that required access to internal data or systems or deep industry knowledge or onboarding. These were, as the organization called it, the we should and I shouldn't tasks, the things that we all have. Finding research trends in a certain space or industry, helping prepare for a conference by crunching a list, looking at how our job descriptions compare to those or other companies, projects that are perfect for a college student, but may not be the best use of time for any of us as experienced professionals. Now, at the same time that these hiring managers were getting work off their plate, the recruiting team was building a pipeline of interested, qualified candidates for those early career roles. The student who had ties to those locations, the ones who wanted to be in Rockford, Illinois, or Texarkana, or Fargo, or Wichita, or wherever. But students who also saw what the company was like, even though it didn't have the brand recognition of some more well-known organizations. Students who were excited about potential internships and full-time roles at that organization. And the professionals loved it. First, they were getting the support on projects that they didn't have time to get done, but more importantly, they were now proactively coming to HR, asking to hire these students for full-time roles or summer internships. Now, again, as a reminder, these are professionals that were pushing back on any entry-level hiring. They only wanted to hire people with 5, 10, 15 years of experience. Now they're coming to HR saying, we think Jeff is amazing. We want to bring him in. This was launched in one department at the company. And what also happened was other teams were then coming to HR asking to participate. So while this early career team couldn't be anywhere, everywhere, they now had a platform with an always on candidate pool, a candidate pool for when they needed it, with ties to their location and with real interest in this organization and the skills to do well on the role. So again, bringing this all together, every organization is different and faces different challenges. The LA company with the strong brand is facing different challenges than the smaller company that doesn't have a massive recruiting effort and can be everywhere, or the Fortune 5 that's not well known, or the company that's in a smaller town that finds it difficult to recruit or to keep talent. All of them can use geography to their advantage. Our research the past 10 years shows that the Parker Dewey platform makes it easy to do that, easy to build those relationships through these short-term project-based engagements so that the organizations aren't relying solely on brand or budget or geography. It also plugs into what's already being done, making it easy to leverage this resource. And it's not just about connecting you with the student, it's also about getting the behavioral and skills data that can't be found anywhere else, not from the existing recruiting process, not from the resume or other platforms, and get you that data before making the hiring decision, before determining with whom you want to invest more time. And the results are pretty incredible. We've shown some, whether measured by cost or conversion or retention or time spent or angry emails. This is really, really easy and effective to, again, leverage geography as a competitive advantage. So to beat a dead horse, again, we made this easy. We are a platform, a data partner, a low-lift extension of your team, really helping you drive better results in early career hiring, no matter where your roles are based or where the students are based, allowing you to have that always-on pipeline of talent for when you need them, to get those early signals of fit and intent before you invest all of the time, and ultimately fill the roles faster with talent that's more likely to stay. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions if people have. Again, I see a comment from someone, for in Denver, it's too expensive for early entry level roles. Yeah, that's one thing we hear quite a bit. It's funny because a lot of students have said, we want to be in San Francisco, be New York or Boston. But then either before they take that job, they look at the cost of living and they realize it's not a fit. Or in some cases, they take that role and almost immediately leave. One of the examples I gave before, they were actually using the relationship they were building with the student to highlight why Cincinnati was such a cost-effective and worthwhile place to live, how much they could get for their money there versus here in Chicago. So again, yes, yes, yes. One other thing I want to highlight is while we're talking about these projects being done remote, I am not a believer in remote full-time work. I am a believer, as we alluded to before, that the entry-level roles for recent college grads, for summer internships, all of these things should be on site. First of all, it leads to better hiring. It lets the student get mentored and coached and learn about the business and build those connections between the student and the organization. But it's also what students want. Again, if you dig into some of the data out there, students do want flexibility. They want to know that if they have a doctor's appointment or a family thing, they can work from home occasionally. But they primarily want to be in the office. They want to be in the office. They want to build those connections. They want to learn. They want to be mentored. And that's something that I think gets missed. So while all of the examples show remote projects, it's not meant as a replacement for the on-site full-time role or summer internship, but rather a recruiting tool that takes the flexibility of remote recruiting, but still drives those connections and relationships that employers and students are both hungry for. Any other questions from the chat, or did I do that good of a job? I don't see any. So I guess I'll leave everyone with one challenge. Send us your entry-level role. Send us a job description that you have that's hard to fill. It might be a difficult location. It might be a role that's highly competitive. It might be something that sort of intersects all of those things. Highly competitive, shortage of candidates, tough to assess for, difficult location. Send us that job description. We have an entire team here that takes those job descriptions and we create these project-based experiences that, again, make it easy for you to leverage what we've shown you, but also really, really engaging and effective to work with the student and to drive that interest. So if you share one of those roles, again, using the QR code or the link at the bottom, we're happy to take a crack and show you some of the data. Show you the types of students you can engage, let you see firsthand how powerful this can be, but also how well it fits into the existing processes you already have in place, and how you can really harness geography, not as a limitation, but as a competitive advantage. With that, this concludes the webinar. Thank you again for the time. We'll be sharing the recording and slides afterwards. Have a wonderful rest of the day.